Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish. This is one of a series of programmes we're doing on Broadcasting Scotland, reviewing the stories of the previous year. Today we focus on the politics of the United States and of Europe. Joining me to discuss the stories which made the headlines over the year are William Duguid, blogger and writer and mainstay of the Perth Yes Hub. I'm also joined by Richard Thomson, erstwhile leader of Aberdeenshire Council, MP for Gordon until 2024 and prospective candidate for Holyrood next year. Welcome to you both.
Good to see you.
Hello.
Well, inevitably we start with politics in the US this year, and my goodness, where to start with the election of Donald Trump, the first convicted felon to be elected President of the United States. Turbulent election period. First of all, he was standing against Joe Biden, the incumbent president, who was then persuaded to step down and replaced by Kamala Harris. All sorts of confusing information and a very nasty campaign, which resulted in Donald Trump being re-elected. We'll start with you, William. What are your thoughts on what the United States brought us this year?
Well, at one stage it would have seemed a surprise. Just at the point where Kamala Harris became the candidate, it seemed as if maybe the Democrats were on the road to perhaps fending off another Trump presidency. But as the campaign went on, it became increasingly clear, well, two things became clear, I think. One is that actually the Democrats didn't necessarily have all that much to say to ordinary working Americans about their situation, and it seemed to be pretty much in line with the elite, much as the Republicans would have been. And the other thing that came into the picture was a quite astonishing propaganda effort by Elon Musk, revealing the reason perhaps why he purchased Twitter in 2017. And as the election grew closer, it began to become clear that certainly it was not going to be a slam dunk for the Democrats by any means, but actually it was far worse than that for them on the night. And a convincing victory for Trump, and perhaps astonishing to those who think, yes, convicted felon, yes, somebody who tried to subvert democracy in 2021, and all sorts of other very obviously weird things about him, and yet a convincing victory. You can juggle with the figures all you like, but the American people have spoken. And was it Groucho Marx that said the people have spoken, the bastards? And now they have to, well, live with it, because it looks as if it's going to be slightly different from the 2016 to 2020 presidency, and maybe not an improvement on it either. There's a long way to go. And if it weren't for the fact that we were all going to be exceptionally affected by it, it would be one to get the popcorn out for. But yeah, watch out in 2025 ongoing.
Thank you. Richard, what are your recollections of the US election and the result of it?
Very much the same as Williams, I have to say. We went into this election campaign. Obviously, Trump had managed to keep an almost death chokehold over the Republican Party. The traditional Republicans absolutely cowed and enthralled to Trump's "Make America Great Again" movement, and increasingly it became obvious that Biden was no longer up to the job of being the candidate who could not only stop Trump, but more importantly, actually govern America for the next 4 years, having stopped him. Now, I think there are questions there for the Democrats to answer about how long they hid that situation from those who were in a position to make a difference to that. But whatever the merits might have been of Kamala Harris as a presidential candidate, certainly I thought a great deal of Tim Walz once he emerged. I thought he was a very engaging presence in the campaign trail. But whatever you think about Kamala Harris and her merits, she clearly didn't have much of a policy platform that appealed to people. And in the end, despite getting a bit of a bump in the polls, when people were going to cast their votes, they weren't necessarily doing it based on what nice liberal Europeans thought of the outcome. They were doing it based on what they thought was going to be best for the USA in the next 4 years. Now, I think it's worrying that people, having done that, came to the conclusion that Donald Trump was with all they'd experienced of him previously in the White House, thought that he was in some way the answer. Certainly peddling solutions to American economic ills like tariffs. Well, tariffs are not going to restore American supremacy and prosperity. All they do is make everybody poorer in the end. So, he peddled a series of platforms that were lacking, at least to my mind, in merit, but nevertheless, people voted for him, as William said, and they did so decisively. And so I suppose the one benefit, one encouragement we can take from that is that there's no Florida-style hanging chads debate to be had. There's no argument, ironically, since Trump and his followers were trying to promulgate this over the last 4-year period. No question of the election being in any way uncertain. He's won it for better or worse, and he's won it fair and square. And the rest of the world is going to have to adapt to that and buckle up. Certainly for Europe, I think there's going to be implications there in terms of Ukraine, Russia, in terms of NATO. I don't think that is something that should fill us with any delight or confidence, but nevertheless, he's there. He's going to be there for the next 4 years, and we're just going to have to get used to it.
Thanks, Richard. I'd like to pick up on one point that you made there when you said that the whole Republican Party was enthralled to Donald Trump. It seems that the opposition to him will also have to come from the Republican Party, given the weakness of the Democrats not having control of either house. But it seems that the rather strange candidates that he has nominated for his cabinet, that there is disquiet in the Republican Party with the likes of Tulsi Gabbard and his nomination for Attorney General already being turned down. Do you think that there will be a mini revolt in the Republican Party against these choices?
I'm not sure, but certainly those in Capitol Hill elected in the Republican ticket need to remember why they're there and remember their own mandates and remember that the checks and balances built into the American Constitution only work when they are prepared to act independently and use the mandates that they've been given, but also for the longer-term good of the Republican Party and therefore the longer-term health of American democracy. It does nobody any favours to have Capitol Hill stuffed with people who are utterly beholden to President Trump. People, as I say, have to remember why they were elected, and also they have to stand up for those things in which they believe. And if they believe that the policy agenda being put forward by Trump, his associates, or by his picks for high cabinet office are unsuitable, then they have a duty, an obligation, a patriotic duty to use their mandates to challenge that and tackle it and to make sure that more suitable candidates are in place, because that is what they have been voted in to do. That is their duty, and to all Americans, irrespective as to where their political allegiances lie. But longer term, the Republican Party clearly needs to re-establish its independence and get itself back out from underneath the minority of MAGAs who have effectively taken them over. People need to re-find their confidence and redraw what it means to be a on the conservative right in America to get out from these underrepresented groups who basically seem to have the Republican Party in their thrall at the moment, because there certainly has to be room in American politics for politicians who want to see an efficient state without peddling the fiction that you can reduce it by fantastic fractions, as Elon Musk appears to believe can be. There has to be those who believe that the state and religion must be separate, and who stand up for values of individual freedom and liberty, and who believe in who believe that the private sector needs room to flourish. Those are perfectly honourable political traditions that the Republican Party has always held to. And at some point, you would like to hope that in order to get back to a more normal form of politics, there will be people in the Republican Party who start speaking up for those principles, and who can point out vividly how far the Trump and the Make America Great Again movement, as it so describes itself, how far they are drifting away from that intellectual heritage in the Republican Party.
Thank you. We shall see. William, I'd like to return to a point that you made, and that was Elon Musk and the effect that he had on the election. I see that recently he's also said that he will consider financing Democratic candidates in primaries where a more right-wing or non-liberal, as he calls it, candidate seeks to unseat the current the current holder of the seat in the House or the Senate. It seems like he is not just supporting Trump; he wants control of everything.
Well, move the Democratic Party further to the right. Yes, that would be a strategy. The problem is that his resources are seemingly great enough for him to do pretty well what he likes. And he doesn't seem yet to be getting reined in that regard. And we may come to his contributions, shall we say, or potential contributions to politics elsewhere. And it's not just Elon Musk. There are others behind Trump, not perhaps financing him to the same extent, that give one great cause for concern. The Project 2025 crew, for example, and just what sort of America they seem to want to build. And it looks as if they want to build it semi-permanently, and that would be part of the reason for making sure that any opposition to the Republicans was suitably skewed to the right. And in America, money has always talked to a certain extent, but now it seems to be screaming quite loudly. And that's beginning to leak over into other countries as well. And I think this is an ongoing problem, particularly in the information age, where the money also has such a stranglehold on the means of communication.
Yeah, you said it's spreading over into other countries. I know we're focusing on the US and Europe today, but surely there's a lesson for us in the United Kingdom with campaign financing, which has recently bubbled up again after Labour saying that they were going to clamp down on it.
Yeah, yes, and I think this may be coming up in due course, but the initial reaction to it by the Labour Party has not been encouraging.
And while we're still on America, you mentioned, Richard, the Democrats have got to think about the future. Well, I suppose the first part of the future they have to think about are the midterm elections, which come up in 2 years for certain seats in the House and the Senate. Is there a candidate or personality that the Democrats can rally behind, do you think?
I honestly don't know. I mean, I think that possibly at this point it's more about trying to find people who might be in a position to run for the White House next time round. So in that sense, let a thousand flowers bloom. Obviously, there's those who would have been in consideration for running this time round, but I think that they'll be looking for new personalities. But above all, I think what's needed really for the Democrats, if I was advising them in very kind of high level terms, is to reflect on why such a part of their base that appeared to be nailed on electorally in previous elections was so happy to vote for Trump. And it's, there's only so much you can put down to Trump being able to tell people what you think they wanted to hear. But in many cases, Trump told people quite openly, what he was about, even though like tariffs, it wouldn't necessarily be in the interests of certain, particularly labour groups, they went and voted for him anyway. So there's just this feeling that Trump would be able to sort things out, however you choose to define that, and that's an element that he really tapped into. That he was not part of the Washington elite, and that somehow he represented something that was different in politics, and that he and his chosen henchmen would be the ones to go in and sort it out. So the Democrats have to reflect very carefully on how that message was able to gain any traction, but also how, without simply following him in the Overton window to the political right in that sense, how they are able to reconnect with those supporters who traditionally they've been able to rely on in the past. They're going to be able to critique the Trump administration in office, so that very quickly that administration will again begin to accumulate baggage, failed personalities and failed policies as well. But they need to find a way of reconnecting with that base. And that's not just about personalities, it's about having the political message coming from the diagnosis of the bigger things like the economics and politics at play, to craft a message and a diagnosis and a set of solutions and a set of messages that can once again resonate with those who are likely to vote Democrat. Because unless they do that, I think that they are destined to be on the political fringes for quite some time. There was a smugness a few years back in the Democrats that demographics was going to do all the heavy lifting for them, that younger, more liberal people were going to come through who would never in a million years dream of voting Republican. Well, many of them are voting Republican, and basically the Democrats have got quite a bit of work to do. But, the good thing is they've got a bit of time to road test those messages and to see new talent come through. But that's very much where they are. They're on a rebuild mission at the moment, I would think. And, that's what the sooner they start, the sooner you imagine they will get there.
Yeah, thanks. We tend to judge American politics by their foreign policy, which of course is of absolutely no interest to the average voter in Wisconsin or Pennsylvania, where they concentrate on home issues such as inflation. An American said to me, the problem with you in Europe is that you take Trump literally, but not seriously, whereas in the United States we take him seriously and not literally. I'm just looking for some hope that it won't be as bad as it seems, William.
You're looking to me for hope. Good.
Yes.
That's a mistake people have often made. It's very unpredictable. Trump has made lots of statements, for example, about ending the war in Ukraine and making a decisive intervention in the Middle East. But he hasn't said how it will happen, and neither of those is by any means easy to unravel, and precipitate action could cause all sorts of unforeseen consequences. So, if nothing else, Trump's foreign policy may result in the other bits of NATO taking more responsibility for themselves, whether or not that turns out to be a good thing. How he relates in the end to the other big powers, both rising and existing, how particularly he deals with Vladimir Putin, but also how he deals with China, is all part of the big geopolitical question of the next 4 years. And one of the reasons, I think, for being worried is that we are at such a dangerous point in history, it would appear, with so much being uncertain, so much seemingly being out of control in so many places. You would think it would require a very nuanced hand in the tiller. Trump would tell you that it just needs decisive intervention of the right sort. I think another thing that would slightly worry me is that in 2016, he had people behind him who might have been advising him in certain ways, and sometimes he might have listened to them. This time, I get the feeling that he is surrounded, and this may be reflected in some of his picks for the big positions, by people who are of the same mind as him and just want to push him down the way he wants to go, or even worse, those who have who are effectively puppet masters, who are quite happy for him to wreak havoc, because from havoc ultimately comes the opportunity for profit.
Yes, and I'd like to pick up that final point with you, Richard, the puppet master, Elon Musk, and two giant egos in the same room. That does not bode well.
No, it doesn't, and I agree with everything that William said there. Look, I think I very much liked what your acquaintance had said and how they put that. And I think there's something in that. But I think one of the things that you see around Trump is it's almost like he's surrounded by a pack of yapping dogs who are all making a lot of noise and all snarling and growling and nipping and snapping away. And the man himself often just is content to let that happen and to allow uncertainty to build round about him. And then he goes and makes whatever decision he goes on and makes that may or may not be in line with what you've heard before. I think he's somebody who thrives on chaos and on having almost like that pack of dogs round about him. So, taking him seriously without taking him literally might give some peace of mind, but I think it's because we take him literally that we don't take him seriously. But he's surrounded by a group of ideologue or people who've surrounded him. Tend to be ideologues, attention seekers, hangers on. I don't think Elon Musk fundamentally is all that different from that. But it's going to be a bumpy ride one way or the other. And I think, looking to ourselves for our defence increasingly, it's past time that more European countries did more to contribute to their own defence. But, giving your example from the Midwest, it's not so long ago in history that twice in a century, young Americans came across the Atlantic to fight for freedom and liberty in Europe. I very much hope that they're not ever called upon to do that again. But certainly the strategic interests of Europe and the US are so intertwined that it's very disturbing and disorientating to find somebody in the White House who appears to have so little care or outwardly obvious understanding of that. So, I think that we probably have to get better at tuning out some of the noise and hoping that that good advice does get through to him and that his judgments will not always be flawed. But, certainly we had a very turbulent first 4 years. I don't expect that the next will be any different. And as William said, he had some very competent, strong-minded characters round about him last time. And, when you've got people like James Mattis and, Rex Tillerson, who have spoken so vividly and contemptuously of the way that he conducted himself in office, I'm afraid it doesn't give me a great deal of hope that we're headed for anything more tranquil this time round.
Thank you. You mentioned NATO there, and we will return to that in a little while. But now I'd like to look at European politics generally. And there's been a theme in the British media that Europe is drifting to the right, and they point to the rise of the AfD in Germany and Marine Le Pen and the Front National in France. It may be the case, but Marine Le Pen seems to have done something which is not popular in France in bringing down the Barnier government. The AfD in Germany has done quite well, but it looks like it will be a massive win for the CDU, the moderate conservatives in February. Separate problems in Eastern Europe with pro-Russian candidates being funded, and we'll talk about interference later. But is there really a drift to the right in European politics, in your view, William?
I think there is a drift towards the right. It's not yet at the point where the right will get power because the coalitions can be put together to fend them off. But certainly, some far right opinions now are becoming normalised, I would say, within Europe, and reflected in a sense by reform in the UK. And parties that previously were fringe parties look as if they're here for a much longer time and more serious business. And the question is whether it's just that people's attitudes are actually changing and the Overton window, as Richard alluded to, is shifting towards the right, or whether there's something else going on, either at the same time or in its own right. And one of the things that it might simply be is that it's been a hell of a period for incumbent parties. They've had a lot to deal with in the last 4 years, from COVID onwards to energy prices and general economic issues. And a lot of people are extremely cheesed off and taking it out on the incumbents. And that's to a certain extent where some of the votes for right-wing parties, including Reform, I might add, are coming from. So it's not necessarily just a seismic shift. It's a challenge, if you like, for the more traditional parties, if you like, to rise to. Basically, can you actually do things for people where they feel as if you're working in their interests effectively? And if you can do that, you will probably hold on to power. If you can't do that, people are now at the stage where they're quite prepared to vote for parties that maybe they wouldn't have considered voting for in the past.
Thank you. Yeah, what I was alluding to in the British media's response was it's much more convenient to point figures at those nasty Europeans who are turning to fascism again while ignoring the rise of the right in Britain. So I wonder what your view is, Richard, on what the true state of European politics is in terms of a rightward move.
Yeah, clearly there's an appetite for that. There's a sense of economic stagnation. Some of that is down to effects of COVID, but there's also because we're now in a more atomised, a less respectful environment. We take our information from different sources. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but when it creates kind of it creates people who seek self-validation rather than necessarily being challenged by different views. So we kind of seek out the views that we're most comfortable with a lot of the times, and we're not as open. I think it's very possible online to go into a bubble, and I think there are certain groups that have become quite radicalised. Young men are often highlighted, but they would not be the only ones. And I think that if there's a general scunner factor with politicians, there is a greater instinct in people sometimes to vote for those that they see are disruptors, and they may not have any great faith in those individuals themselves, but they think it will really stick it to the establishment and shake things up, and that can only be better, even if very often the only outcome is that it gets worse. But I think that has created a bit of a vacuum for complete shysters like Nigel Farage to try and insert himself into with superficial solutions, simple solutions to complex problems, and to try and point the finger and blame and exacerbate existing tensions, and frankly to race bait about certain things, all while maintaining that kind of man in the pub persona that some people gravitate towards. So I think that that has helped to normalise a lot of right-wing attitudes. The idea also that that somehow people are being victimised for only thinking common sense thoughts as they would like to see it. It's a very, very self-referencing idea, but it's a way of helping to normalise that. And there are a number of bad actors online who do do things like that. You see the memes that fly about on Twitter and on Facebook. It starts out with something innocuous like and share this picture if you think people should go to prison for being nasty to animals. So of course people will like and share that, and before you know it, 5 posts on from that account, then you're not that far away from things that are outright racist and Islamophobic often. So, I think that creating the idea that things can't be talked about when they are being quite openly talked about, that's another way of trying to create a victim mentality for people that then makes that then helps the political right. But I think also that we also have to look at the failure of our economy to deliver the standard of living that people would expect, because quite often it's that economic failure. And people are then encouraged not to look at the causes of that economic failure, but to point the fingers. And it's quite bizarre that we would point the finger at immigrants coming to these shores with very little other than ambition to do better for themselves and to make a contribution, and blame them for the fact that we don't have enough houses, or that we've consistently underinvested in our public services over the last 30 or 40 years. So, there are politicians who deserve to be held accountable for poor choices over that time and poor ideologies. But it's very, very easy to point the finger and victim blame. And I speak particularly about the UK in that context, but certainly with proportional voting systems, it's easier for the right to make a breakthrough, as we've seen in Europe. We're seeing that Reform are eyeing up seats at Holyrood and in Wales, and it looks like if they retain current levels of support, they will make some kind of breakthrough. But certainly they got a very large number of votes at the UK election, even if the voting system didn't reward them. But also the Conservative Party, just as the Labour Party has traditionally curbed the extremes, if you like, of the far left, the Conservative Party has always absorbed some pretty horrendous right-wing views and effectively marginalised that. And I think the real danger that we've seen is because the Conservatives in this country have moved so far to the right, they're chasing after that Reform vote. They're not going to get it back. The real danger is when the Labour Party starts thinking it needs to go to the right to chase after that as well, instead of setting out that clear, compelling vision about why it has an analysis that is better, and that we don't need to blame the people coming with nothing for our ills. We actually need to blame the bad choices and the idea that you can somehow cut your way to prosperity. I think, Keir Starmer's instincts broadly might be in the right place in some of that, but my goodness, he's pretty inept when it comes to communicating that, when it comes to his missions on the economy. So, there's certainly been an advance of the right, but I think much of that is down to a failure of politicians of the centre and the left to maintain credibility and to find a way of countering that doesn't involve chasing after where they think the crowd is running.
Yeah, it's fine to blame politicians, but I wonder if there's some fault to be found with the electorate also. It's a marvellous trick that people like Trump and Musk have pulled off in the United States, that they are not part of the establishment, two of the richest men in the country. Georgescu in Romania, who topped the first round of the presidential poll, was outside of government, despite the fact that he'd worked for the Interior Ministry for many years in the past. But is it just that the electorate are impatient, that they want change immediately? Here in Britain, you're elected for a 5-year period, and okay, journalists make much of the first 100 days, but the speed at which the electorate turned on the Labour Party was really quite astonishing compared to tolerance in the past. I mean, I'm not saying that the Labour Party didn't deserve it, but it does seem a very, very hasty electorate, that we want change and we want it now, get it fixed this week.
Yes, the electorate is fairly susceptible to being bombarded with information from all points, and this is maybe me exculpating them to a certain extent. It is incumbent on us all to preserve democracy by bothering to read up about things, but it is difficult and confusing when you are being assaulted by all manner of disinformation and misinformation from various sources, and we still haven't sorted out the problems that are created by the 24/7 news cycle and social media all over the place. It may take us several decades to get to the point where it's an unvarnished good, if indeed we as a species are still here. So I don't think I'm getting as far as blaming the folk for not being smart enough to see where they're being led down the garden path. I think democracy has some problems because of the way it's been driven over the last 10 to 20 years. And I'm hoping that it doesn't take the election of a far-right party and bad consequences coming from that to finally bring people to their senses, because that usually turns out to be a fairly disorganised and chaotic period of history. I would be trying to educate our kids to be doing critical thinking a little bit more from an early age. And it is difficult because the odds are stacked against you, but if people can start seeing where they're being led, and if they can grow up thinking about, well, maybe we're being led here, maybe you will get a more educated electorate, and maybe you will get more sensible decisions.
Thank you. Yes, Finland has just announced that it will introduce a class in critical thinking for all primary school children. But talking about how people are influenced, and there's been a large amount of visible foreign interference in elections in Europe. It started, well, we know that it was present in Moldova, the Russians spending a huge amount of money there trying to unseat Maya Sandu, the president, and her pro-European views. The Bulgarian intelligence service released a report last week saying that £69 million was spent by the Russians to influence their elections. We had the state in Romania where Ceausescu, who I already mentioned, finished first in the first round of the presidential elections, and his entire campaign was via TikTok, hugely financed by Russia, and indeed there was the Defense Council of Romania said that there was a number of cyber attacks by the Russian Federation on Romania during the election, and went to the extent of annulling the first round of the presidential election. So social media influence, buying of votes, again, it's a problem. We're saying, oh yes, that's happening to those Europeans, but potentially it could happen here. Perhaps it already has happened here, because the report on potential Russian influence on the Brexit referendum never came about. So what are the risks here, and what can be done, Richard?
Well, we've obviously been victim ourselves in the UK to a very stunning example of electoral manipulation, which happened in plain sight during the Brexit referendum, and that was the sheer amount of money that got laundered through Northern Ireland in order to disguise the origin of that money. I think most of us suspect it came from Russia, and which then unquestionably bought the outcome that then resulted. Now, not because everybody believed everything literally, but again, people scunnered with an elite decided to use their vote to shake things up without actually necessarily, I think, in a lot of cases, realising what would happen, that they would actually win. And I still have that memory of Michael Gove and Boris Johnson in particular looking like a naughty schoolboy the morning after the Brexit vote, and it just kind of put in mind, Michael Caine turning around and saying you were only supposed to blow the bloody doors off. Well, we're living with the consequences of that now, big time. But look, we have a set of funding rules in British politics that have never been fit for purpose. Foreign donations, like those donations that bought the Brexit referendum, they came about because when Tony Blair decided to revamp the political funding environment, his Labour Party set the rules with no higher principle in mind than stopping Sean Connery from donating to the SNP. That's why overseas donations were banned into mainland UK politics. But because he didn't want to upset anybody who might be donating to Sinn Féin from North America, that's why the route to donate into Northern Ireland was left completely intact. So I think there's a number of things that could be locked down in terms of where it's permissible to donate from, how much political parties are actually able to spend, not just in the short campaign, but in the longer term campaign, and also in terms of funding within the UK. There's a couple of very shady organisations that give lots of money to the Conservative and Unionist Party. One of them's a dining club called the United and Cecil. People give lots of money to the United and Cecil, and then it's only the United and Cecil that appears as the contributor. So effectively, anyone who, and I don't suspect that their dinner invites are open to anyone, incidentally, but those who go there give lots of money, and then we never get to find out who they are because it's a dining club that's given the donation, and the Electoral Commission have to be happy with that because that's what the law says. Another one is the Midlands Industrial Council, which has a fundraising role for the Conservative Party. And again, presumably, if its name is accurate, it takes donations from business people in the West Midlands of England, and again, funnels it into supporting individual candidates and the Conservative Party headquarters and their campaigns, again, without anyone being able to see who's donating what. So our rules are an absolute cesspit, and frankly, we'd be better off having no rules at all, because any party that determines it's going to play by the rules is effectively going to be outspent and outgunned anyway. So we could do a lot to tighten up our own rules for donations within the UK. We should certainly be making the UK politics inoculated fully from the pernicious effects of overseas funding and lock Elon Musk out at source, along with others. But then, as William said, there's all sorts of other issues around about misinformation and disinformation, and we need to be making sure that people are able to tell the difference between good information and bad information. And frankly, no more than about 10 or 15 minutes on Facebook would tell you how woefully inadequate most of the people that we would take seriously in our everyday lives, how poor they can often be at spotting the scams and the political propaganda and and that which is completely misleading. So we need to be better intellectually prepared. People need to be better at spotting misinformation. But we also need to have a media regulatory environment that works, and we need to make sure that we shut off the source of funding to the bad actors and make sure that we do have a proper level playing field. But of course, that's not in the interests of the Labour Party or the Conservative Party, so that'll be exactly why something like that simply doesn't ever happen.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, funding is clearly one issue, but this information does not need to be expensive. To take another example from Romania, last week, a few weeks ago, one of the media organisations there, Recorder, set up an imaginary candidate for the office of Prime Minister, which actually is something you can't vote for in Romania, so it would be a non-existent election. But he promised he would raid the Romanian reserves and give 2 kilograms of gold to every citizen of the country. Totally farcical. The organisation then brought in social media expert who managed to get 1 million views of this in 4 hours, costing almost nothing. So it's more than money, isn't it, William?
Yes, well, I didn't know this particular story, so it's interesting to hear about. It's really all sorts of things that will sway people, but another thing we haven't perhaps spoken about that might alleviate this is, I think really democracy needs to be decentralized to an extent, and people themselves at local level have to have more say in what's done to them and why, because that automatically means they're thinking perhaps more in a more connected way about what's going on, but also it becomes harder to subvert. Not impossible, but harder. And the only thing we can do at the moment, because there's such forces working against proper democracy, that we just have to make it harder. And I think if people had more say in what happens to them locally, and that went on through the whole setup, then you might begin to get a slightly more healthy outlook, and there might be less scope for people to skew it. But we have a long way to go, and we're a long way from achieving that. In fact, if anything, pretty much everywhere, and certainly in the UK, things are going the opposite direction.
Thank you. Well, staying with Europe and not just the European Union, also the UK's role within it. Richard, you already mentioned NATO and what the future of that is going to be with an unsure future on the American side with the comments that President Trump has made. He has suggested that every member of NATO should spend 5% of GDP on its contribution. I presume as a businessman he's prepared to settle for less, but it is something of a wake up call, and a necessary wake up call to European countries, is it not, to pay more for their defence?
Yes, it is, and Trump's not the first person from the US political firmament to point out that a great many European countries have not even been meeting the 2% of GDP requirement for defence spending, which is supposed to be a condition of being in NATO. Now, it's interesting. It's not a set amount, a set number, a set amount of money that goes in. It's just a set amount of your economic output should be spent on that. And 2% was a pretty modest ask, I think, in peacetime. It's certainly very, very modest in current circumstances. So, there is a moral obligation on the countries that have signed up to NATO to make sure that they are, at the very least, meeting that requirement. And although there's a great deal I could criticise Mr. Trump for saying when it comes to Europe or anything else for that matter on this point about those countries that are not pulling their weight, he's absolutely right. And it's something that NATO's European members should have been putting their own houses in order about a long time ago. That said, threatening to withdraw the protection of NATO from European countries, I think, is incredibly unhelpful and destabilising potentially. But the big issue facing NATO at the moment is how to react to any emerging threat from Russia. Now, I'd hoped that in my lifetime we'd seen the last of that threat from the east, but clearly it's back with a vengeance. I, like the rest of the world, I remain in ignorance about how Donald Trump reckons he can end the conflict in Ukraine in just one day. But certainly there is a real problem facing the Ukrainians in terms not just of a lack of support when it comes to providing ammunition, but loomingly potentially a loss of political support there. And if Putin is allowed to consolidate the territory that he has gained through his aggressive and illegal war in Ukraine, it's not too difficult to imagine that the next time he tries something like that, it may be in Georgia, but certainly he will be looking to test the resolve of NATO to defend the Baltics and perhaps Poland as well. So, NATO countries in Eastern Europe, I think, are right to be vigilant. They're right to be nervous. But certainly NATO, for many years after what we thought was the end of the Cold War, seemed to have lost its role, lost its purpose. I think it's possible now to see a role and a purpose for it again. But it's going to require, whether European governments like it or not, it's going to require them to take on a greater responsibility for their own defence, for making the financial contribution to that, and to make sure that they are equipped to make sure that they can adopt the defensive posture that means that we never ever will look at another war in Europe as we saw of two times in the last century.
Yeah, thank you. Broadening it out from NATO, William, European security is not just the military threat from the east, it's potentially a trade threat from the United States and goodness knows where else. And we've seen recently Norway, which has always stood apart from the European Union, looking to form a closer relationship because of the trade benefits. Whereas the Great Reset promised by Labour in the United Kingdom and the EU does not really seem to be happening, other than some nice words in Brussels.
No, it may go on from the nice words in Brussels, but they're certainly not focusing on what for me would be the obvious thing to do, which is as near as damn it to get yourself back in the single market, freedom of movement, and all the things that used to grease the wheels of trade. The EU and Europe generally needs to be a strong bloc economically, because there is going to be what's tantamount to a trade war if Trump, for example, brings in the selection of tariffs that he's talking about. Again, that becomes a whole chaotic situation, but you need to have some internal strength that currently is lacking within Europe. It needs to be built up there, but certainly we need to be part of it, because I think that we may end up being, in the UK, uniquely affected, because we don't have as strong a link with Europe as we need to have, and to a certain extent we're relying on building up trade with America, where the opposite may turn out to be the case.
Sadly, yes. So there's been quite a lot of negativity about the United States' relationship with Europe, about the state of politics in Europe. So I'd like to, as it's the end of the year, just ask whether democracy is it flourishing in Europe? Is it under threat, William?
I think democracy everywhere is under threat, and I think it gets back to misinformation and our inability to cope with it, and it needs to be sorted, but it can't be sorted quickly. Democracy remains the best of a bad bunch of how to run the place, but we certainly need it, and we certainly need to have it fairly strongly. At the same time, I've got to say, the world as a whole is facing pretty unique challenges in the next 20 years, and it's going to be interesting to see how that gets accommodated within the democratic structure. I'm talking there about the things we absolutely have to do to combat climate change, to adapt to climate change, and I suppose one of the most worrying things, it was something I've returned to a few times on the Scotland at 7 broadcasts, is we have ourselves a potential asylum seeker crisis of massive proportions, not just because we've been bombing places, but because parts of the world become uninhabitable and large numbers of people will migrate. They'll have to migrate or die to places that are habitable. And I don't think the sort of structures we have now are going to be able to cope with that. And we need to think very, very fast about how we achieve an assimilation of those people and maintain democracy and maintain peace and stability. In pure number terms, it's perfectly possible to accommodate people in areas of the world which remain habitable while we're trying to adapt. But it's going to require a massive change in attitude. And that, for me, is the big thing that's a question mark, both for democracy and for the general stability of society in the next 20 years, not just in Europe, but very much in Europe.
Thank you. Yeah, you've mentioned structures there. It strikes me that after the Second World War, the United Nations operated with 2 members of the Security Council, absolutely anti-democratic, but fairly effective for quite a long time. And the United Nations now seems to have collapsed as a force, whether it be for climate change or for protection of countries being invaded. It was once seen as a bastion of democracy and is going. So what do you think for the future, Richard?
Yeah, I think we're reaping the harvest of things like bogus concepts like liberal interventionism, that the rules of and norms of the international rules-based order were for everybody else, and the US and the UK, when it came to Iraq, for example, simply didn't apply. And now we are seeing the consequences of our hypocrisy and that thrown back at us, because that rules-based international order only works so long as countries, states are willing to observe it. But I think there's a real danger in our politics that if we don't have a vigilant and informed electorate, poor choices end up being made collectively on our behalf, and we are very susceptible as a way that we've never been in recent times to the seductive message of authoritarian, television-friendly demagogues who will peddle simple solutions to complex problems and tell us everything else that's gone wrong is everybody else's fault. You're the put upon minority, and we should be able to carry on doing whatever the hell it is that we like, whether it's within our own countries or in the world, consuming resources at the rate that we see fit, because that's the right thing to do, and that's where God and Providence has placed us as being able to do. I think that, like William, I think that I share his analysis and what he's just said, but we need that active, engaged responsibility in our citizens to reward the worthy, to vanquish the scoundrels, and to make sure that we're making the right choices, because ultimately we can only ever be our own salvation, whether that's locally, nationally, or or globally. And as I say, I think that our species stands at something of a crossroads. If we want to save our planet, if we want to be able to live in harmony, then we have to be more tolerant of freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of action, so long as they're not compromising the rights of others. We need to recognise that rights are balanced with responsibilities, and we need to become much more tolerant of each other. So, there's a kind of Springer's final thought on it. But ultimately, we need to be making sure that if we want an international rules-based order, that we are prepared to abide by that themselves, because the rules are there for everybody and not just for the powerful to impose against the powerless, or for the powerful to do exactly as they like, because otherwise you just end up in a situation that we were in previously, before there was a United Nations or even a League of Nations. And I would like to think that the progression of civilization is one that, whatever challenges it faces at the moment, is one which can soon again go forwards, rather than continue going backwards, as it appears to have done recently.
Well, thank you very much. A plea for tolerance is no bad way to end the year. That's it for this full Scottish special on European and US politics. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. To everyone who has donated, and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We set our current fundraising target in April, hoping to reach 36,000 by the end of the year. It is now December, and we have raised almost 20,000, just over half of our target. However, to pay our bills and survive, we urgently need to raise at least £12,000. We have borrowed £12,000 to enable us to survive for now, but the pressure is still on, and we do need to find enough regular donors to give us financial security. We face costs of over £4,000 every month, but only receive donations of around £2,500. We need more regular subscribers, but we need to clear our debts as well. We are at crisis point, and really need to increase our donations to be able to pay our bills and survive. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, and please donate whatever you can afford. Thank you very much to my guests today, William Duguid and Richard Thomson, and thank you wherever you are for watching, and I hope you continue to enjoy the festive season. But for me, goodbye.